Hello, yes, as Ian said, I'm Simon, and I have an MA in studying terrorism and civil war from the Department of War Studies at King's College London. So let me introduce myself a little bit more. So I study political violence, mostly strategy, so what people do and why they do it, but also I'm interested in social structure, and so looking at religion, what is a religion, and what does it mean for a person to have a particular religious imperative to commit violence. So anyway, I will be drawing upon these perspectives, this theme throughout. But also, I do want to be a public intellectual when I grow up. At some point, I want somebody to apply that term to me. I do want to be an academic, but I don't want to be one who's cloistered. And you guys will help me with that by ripping apart everything I say and complaining if I use overly pedantic technical jargon. So, basically, this is what I'm going to talk about. And yes, atheists love cats, humanists love cats, so they're going to do cats throughout. Basically, well, any suggestion that humanism is a religion is likely going to be very contentious amongst humanists. Most humanists would probably set their views in stark opposition to those of the religious, and view religion mainly as a cause of social ills. At the same time, we cannot deny that religions hold a privileged position in both the laws of our society and in the hearts of many Canadians. For many Canadians, religious communities are centers of recreation and social support, and religious affiliations serve as foci of personal identity. Religious organizations enjoy considerable tax benefits, and many people accord clergy great respect, regardless of their denomination. There's an ecumenical pie, and it is delicious. So we need to ask ourselves whether we can partake of that pie in good faith, so to speak, and whether we are comfortable doing so. But unless the identity of being religious holds meaning only as a means to an end, we enter into tricky conceptual territory in our search for answers. Not only do we need to have a good understanding of what it means to be humanist, we also need to understand what it means to be religious. And this is what I hope to explore here. Basically, I'm going to try to provide answers to the following questions. What is humanism? Can we find a single coherent definition, or is the term too general of a catch-all to have much meaning except as a convenient label for atheistic ethics? What is religion? Given the wide and wildly disparate definitions of the term, can we agree upon any understanding that is neither too broad nor too niche? How might humanism be a religion? Simply put, given our definition for religion, does humanism fit the bill? And finally, what are the implications of our findings? If we find that humanism can be reasonably classified as a religion, where do we go from here? So to be honest and upfront, I am going to argue that humanism can be productively and legitimately understood as a religion, and that we should present it as such in public, as well as look for allies amongst other religious organizations in society for some of our causes, campaigns, or initiatives. At least when it comes to the academic side of it, what is a religion, what is humanism, my argument is probably, wouldn't be fairly controversial, but it is certainly a challenge to make it both reasonable and rewarding outside of narrow fields within the academy to view human as a religion. And I'm also hoping that in doing so I can equip the humanist community with some useful discursive and cognitive tools for making the world better and for understanding our place within it. On that note, please feel free to raise your hand and ask me to clarify anything throughout if what I'm saying is confusing or overly technical, particularly if I'm giving definitions, or if you prefer, you can ask me to go over stuff at the end during the discussion period, and I'm hoping to leave a very long block of time for that. So, what is humanism? Well, it's got the word human in there. And certainly there is a distinct and essential focus on human conduct and the human condition as the subject of moral evaluation in the philosophy of those Enlightenment figures like Kant, Bentham, or Mill, for example, whose ideas probably inform many of our fundamental perspectives on ethics, either directly and consciously or kind of spurred within there. The etymology of the word further focuses our attention on the Enlightenment. Humanism gained currency as a non-pejorative ethical notion during the 19th century. Interestingly enough, given the subject of our talk, one of the earliest recognizably humanist organizations was founded in 1856 as the British Humanistic Religious Association. Another 19th century term, secularism, has more recently been married to humanism in order to distinguish it from theistic variants such as Christian humanism, which connects a practical humanist morality to Christian thought and practice. An organized movement for humanism as such, therefore only really emerged with the 1933 publication by what would eventually become the American Humanist Association of the Humanist Manifesto. Signed by 34 prominent academics and Unitarian clergymen, it affirmed the value of the natural sciences and of atheistic liberal ethics. Meanwhile, the Union of Ethical Societies, which would eventually become the British Humanist Association, had been founded in 1896 upon similar though more generally articulated principles, and had brought together numerous smaller ethical societies where those who prefer to talk about the meaning of life outside of churches gathered. So since then, clearly, organized humanist movements and communities have become widespread and robust. Today, it is not possible to talk about a single ideological or paradigmatic platform for humanism as a whole, but it certainly is possible to describe both the views characteristic of the platforms of contemporary humanist organizations and of typical humanists themselves. So the AHA describes humanism as a progressive life stance that, without supernaturalism, affirms our ability and responsibility to the ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good of humanity. The DHA describes humanism a little bit more concisely as a way to live good lives without religious or supernatural beliefs. Both organizations strive for greater secularism and universal human rights. As for humanists themselves, they tend to be, at least in my observations, committed liberals, agnostic or atheistic, and cosmopolitan in social and political understandings. Humanists embrace the causes for personal freedoms, mobilizing for such things as same-sex marriage, progressive fiscal policy, and emancipation for women throughout the world. They find power and pleasure in the exercise of reason and the practice of discourse. Nowadays, they tend to extend moral protection beyond human beings to other animals as well. They tend to embrace the scientific establishment and view scientific inquiry as a path to knowledge, the best path to knowledge. They tend not to be ethical relativists, and they view human deeds and misdeeds according to a single standard of right and wrong, though it may be a particularly forgiving and compassionate standard. Most crucially and importantly, that standard is one that prioritizes human well-being, happiness, flourishing, pleasure, or some other similar concept. Humanistic good, and perhaps the only good, lies in what we do to one another, how we do it, and how we achieve our personal goals in life. And we treat this, as humanists, as inviolably, ineluctably true. In short, we have a picture of humanists which can serve as kind of a denotative definition for what kind of thing humanism is. Generally speaking, humanists are as humanists do. Humanists typically pursue human well-being and think that a liberal secular society is the best way to achieve it, renounce supernatural guidance, reject the moral significance of obedience to divine command, and consider science and reason the best the best way to explain and navigate the world. Humanism, therefore, is a belief system that tells us what it means to be good, how to be good, and how to know how to be good. It has meta-ethical, normative, epistemological, and pragmatic components. This all sounds very far from the strict emphasis on divine power, revelation, dogma, collective ritual, and clerical authority that we associate with religions such as Christianity or Islam. But I think our focus on these characteristics is misleading. A cute quote by Aldous Huxley there, and a cat. It is possible to find a vast number of definitions for religion in the literature of sociology, anthropology, psychology, and philosophy. One textbook on the study of religion identified this definitional problem as being as old as the study of religion itself. And there are hundreds of contenders. One dictionary definition states that religion is beliefs concerning the cause, nature, and purpose of the universe, and often containing a moral code governing the conduct of human affairs. Another calls it a specific, fundamental set of beliefs and practices generally agreed upon by a number of persons or sects. Others, ritual observances of faith, a personal or institutionalized system grounded in such beliefs and worship, a set of beliefs, values, and practices based on the teachings of a spiritual leader, and a cause, principle, or system of beliefs held with ardor of faith. To name just a few. So it's easy to see how some of these might describe humanism, given that we too have common causes and convictions. But as I've said, there are hundreds of widely divergent definitions and no scholarly consensus. As far as how the term is understood within our atheist, secularist, skeptical, humanist community, though, our definitions tend to be quite pejorative. To quote Greta Christina, a popular atheist and feminist blogger and public speaker, the thing that uniquely defines religion, the thing that sets it apart from every other ideology or hypothesis or social network, is the belief in unverifiable supernatural entities. To quote another popular new atheist blogger, who is somewhat known for his vitriol, P.Z. Myers, religion is not some mild, happy recreational activity. It is a poison of the brain that taints the vast majority of humanity. It is wrong, and it is a fallacious way of learning about the world. I find these two quotes illustrative of two common understandings of religion. The first is what I call the supernatural beliefs definition. That it is a set of immutable or dogmatic beliefs that posit and invoke supernatural entities and that carry metaphysical authority. So they can tell us what right and wrong is, and they instruct us as to what kind of categories comprise reality in the universe. This definition treats religions as sets of ideas about what the world is, physically and metaphysically. The second definition I found common is what I call the opiate of the masses definition. And that is where religion is understood as a form of communal ritual wherein adherents surrender their individual critical faculties to institutions of theological authority, popes, priests, books, whatever, who prescribe conduct and proper truth based upon their interpretation of a sacred revelatory text. In this case, text can even just be a verbal tradition, I mean in a very loose sense. So both these definitions are typical on their own, but many people in our community also move between them for context or take the word religion to mean both together. Surely not incidentally, they portray religion as something which could theoretically be absent in our lives, and naturally they describe things which most of us probably find quite harmful and indefensible. I'm not saying that these two common definitions don't describe important aspects of mainstream religion in society today, but I do think that they are at best insufficient and at worst irrelevant in trying to understand religion at a deeper level. And I'm a distinguished company. For example, in an essay on morality and religion, psychologist Jonathan Haidt, author of a critically acclaimed study into the dimensions of moral behavior, identified what he considers to be two common misunderstandings in many new atheist analyses. The first is that new atheists treat religions as sets of beliefs about the world, many of which are demonstrably false. Yet anthropologists and sociologists who study religion stress the role of ritual and community much more than of factual beliefs about the creation of the world or of life after death. And the second, the new atheists assume that believers, particularly fundamentalists, take their sacred texts literally. Yet ethnographies of fundamentalist communities show that even when people claim to be biblical literalists, they are in fact quite flexible, drawing upon the Bible selectively or ignoring it to justify humane and often quite modern responses to complex social situations. Both of these criticisms suggest that religions are complex, multifaceted, and include both a set of propositions, claims about the world, and practices, interacting in processes of interpretation and ritual, and are closely connected with social forces and structures. This is sociologist Margaret Archer's definition of a cultural system, that is a mutually constituting duality of a propositional register and a set of non-propositional tastes, dispositions, and practices. To put it simply, religions shape and are shaped by what religious people do, and there's no clear distinction between the religious and the cultural. I think the example of Islam can illustrate just how diversely interpreted a single set of religious texts can be. So, Islam is a category that includes communities with religious beliefs spanning the ultra-liberal to the ultra-conservative, and the hyper-mystical to the adamantly orthodox. It's true that almost all Muslims believe in one God, consider Muhammad to be his prophet, and consider the Quran to be God's own words. But the similarities in there. On the most illiberal end of the spectrum, you have Salafi or Wahhabi communities such as those in Saudi Arabia, Sudan, and you have or Somalia, if you've heard of Al-Shabaab. And there are data banding communities in Pakistan and Afghanistan, including the Taliban, or the particular brand of Shiism practicing in Iran. Military jihadi groups like Al-Qaeda emerge from these sects, as do transnational fundamentalist movements such as Hizb ut-Tahrir. Yet there are also brands of Sufism in which access to divine truth and guidance is a matter of esoteric meditation. There are organizations such as Iman or Al-Faita, which agitate for acceptance and legal rights for LGBT people on theological grounds, or political movements such as the Wasatiyya, which present platforms more liberal and democratic than those of many secular parties here or in Europe, but they do so through Islamic language and with reference to Islamic norms. A recent survey found that 70% of the Swedes who identify as part of the Church of Sweden, of the 70% of Swedes who identify as part of the Church of Sweden, only 15% claim to actually believe that Jesus was the Son of God. A quarter identified as agnostic, and a further 15% as atheist. And there are people here in Canada who identify as Muslim, but admit similar non-belief or otherwise define God in the vaguest and least authoritative of terms, throwing around abstract nouns like love or goodness. I remember reading some commentators on our side, such as Sam Harris, asserting that these liberal Muslims are simply not very good at following Islam. But religion is as the religions do. We can't deny that dogmatism, supernatural belief, or collective surrender of the will play very weak roles in establishing meaning in the minds of at least some adherents. A discussion of Islam and Muslims can also show that viewing religions as free-floating ideologies, flexible and projectable, is flawed. Religions are shaped not only by the ideas that we encounter, but by the very structure of society. Consider that there is a strong positive correlation between the extent to which a Muslim sect is socially and theologically liberal, and the extent to and the level of political freedom and social security in the societies in which they're found. Did you see what I did there? The least safe and free places contain the most conservative and puritanical sects. This isn't surprising at first glance. It makes sense that people who believe highly liberal things will create a highly illiberal society. But this argument mixes up cause and effect, at least to some degree, and possibly entirely. A better explanation for why illiberal religion is most prevalent in illiberal society can be found in the literature on the relationship between social structure and personal identity. Originally proposed in 1979 by social psychologists Henry Tashfeld and John Turner, social identity theory holds that people have both an individual and a group identity, and that group identity is prior. It is within a person's perceived group memberships that individual differentiation occurs. Self-esteem is tied to group esteem, which is a product of favorable comparison to other groups. Therefore, people will seek to advance and defend group advantages while combating group disadvantages. In a society experiencing conditions of economic hardship or political conflict, members of some groups may be frustrated entirely in their search for basic needs like security, positive self-esteem, feelings of self-efficacy and control, and a coherent sense of reality. Other groups and their members start to be seen as a collective threat, and people begin to adopt simplistic, categorical views like us versus them. It is in such situations that members of the group begin to seek scapegoats for their poor conditions, and in doing so, begin to understand that reality is increasingly dominated by intergroup interaction, such that personal identity is constantly subordinated. In other words, narratives that justify and prioritize the interests of the group are likely to remain unquestioned, even if they feature, even if it requires individuals to suspend their critical thinking or arrange their personal interests such that even altruistic suicide can be desirable. So, justification for violence is something that you see in every religion. Every religion is going to give you a recipe for when it's okay to use force and what it means to enforce the rule of law. And in situations where you have social conflict, you have very hardline group interaction. The borders between groups are not permeable, and if somebody's bad, they are the worst. In other words, narratives that justify and prioritize thus both the ways in which people develop their identity, including their values and affiliations, and the ways in which people successfully try to navigate their interpersonal lives, play a powerful role in determining what a particular religious community will believe and do. To abstract even further, anarchic societies tend to reward and therefore exhibit an evolutionary pressure towards fierce in-group loyalty and readiness to personally carry out retaliatory violence. In tribal societies where kinship group, or something like it, constitutes the basic unit of social organization, individuals are protected from the predations of those in other groups by the threat of collective revenge. If you abuse me, my family will get together and hurt you, or a member of your family. Hence, in such societies, order is preserved by groups policing their own members and fiercely defending them from external attack. Honor systems such as Pashtun Valley, the code of customary law followed by the Pashtuns or Pathans, from which the majority of Taliban recruits are drawn, are cultural codifications of this, providing robust and effective mechanisms to prevent violence and predation from spiraling out of control and anarchic social conditions. Such codes tend to be articulated and legitimated in religious terms. They are sacred. Little aside, today I read an article in Foreign Policy by a professor from King's College London named Anatol Levin, and he was saying that the Pakistani courts are so corrupt and so feared and loathed by many Pakistanis that they'd sooner resort to the more extreme forms of Sharia law available to them or community justice, because these things, they work, they're accessible and cheap, and they don't require you to pay off a judge and wait a year for a verdict. So in societies where you don't have a really good kind of effective constitutional legal system, then yes, the deeply embedded customary codes that show up in tribal societies become increasingly more effective for people in surviving, since you have to have a justice system somehow. Our sacred principles are thus determined largely by the conditions of our society and by the position of the groups in which we are members. There is a great deal of psychological literature exploring just how this works. Some of the more notable contributions include Kohlberg's theory of moral development, in which a person's understanding of virtues, rules, and norms develops through 6 progressive stages, increasing in nuance and culminating in some kind of universal concept of justice. This process occurs in the same order in members of all cultural groups, but may stop partway at contractual ethics, for example, depending on societal as well as personal context. Jonathan Haidt found that morality centers around universal principles such as care, fairness, loyalty, purity, and respect, and that moral development in action is focused on navigating interpersonal situations and not at all based on the pursuit of truth. It is dependent upon levels of optimism, group structure, and patterns of order and tradition. In other words, our sacred principles are endogenous to social structure. They are generated from within it. Sacred principles play an active role in shaping a great deal of human decision-making. Psychologists have found, for example, that people will reject financially beneficial offers if they perceive their share of such benefits to be grossly unfair by comparison to the share received by another beneficiary, as shown in various ultimatum game experiments. Even important decisions of political and military strategy are often made according to sacred or moral principles, regardless of one's personal piety, as social psychologist Scott Adrian has found in his studies of Israelis, Palestinians, and Americans. All of this suggests that our rationality, our assessment of choices based on their consequential benefits and the validity to our beliefs, is bounded, and that some of the most important and morally significant actions that we can take are driven by a sense of sacred duty and value. The evidence is unequivocal. What people are doing around you will affect what you believe about the world. And understandings of the world which generate effective strategies for survival will be hard for you to seriously question. This suggests that religion should be understood as more than a set of empirical claims invoking or involving the supernatural, or as a set of superstitious rituals. It suggests that a description of religion should include an account of norms and values, tastes, practices, and modes of learning and thinking, which every person possesses and which are highly culturally and socially contingent. If religion is something closely tied up with social identity, structure, and behavior, we should move from questioning whether religions are merely sets of supernatural beliefs to questioning whether supernatural beliefs are essential to understanding religion at all, or whether they are a common though incidental part of something that is about social order and cognition in a more abstract sense. Two scholarly definitions of religion help clarify these questions, I think. The first is the one offered by one of the founding fathers of sociology, Emil Durkheim. And he calls religion a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, that is to say, things set apart and forbidden, beliefs and practices which unite us into one single moral community comprising all who adhere to them. This is a very broad, functionalist definition, and it focuses on how religions allow people to create and apply hierarchies of normative principles, and therefore categorize the world in ways that make morality possible and social institutions legitimate. By this definition, anyone who is a total nihilist is religious, and given all that I said about sacred principles, it is certainly pertinent to a great deal of human behavior. Working from Durkheim's definition, we might understand the role of supernatural propositions, theological authority, and collective ritual not so much as the essence of religious belief, but as mechanisms for its institutionalization and propagation. Things like revelatory texts, idols, holy days, temples, shrines, even miracles are embodiments of religion. They are real, describable, observable things that harden the fluidity of abstract principles into firm bricks that can be used to construct a robust culture of meaning. They are physical, concrete manifestations of something transcendental that connect our own physical reality to the realm of the sacred. This concretizing role of embodiment, of having a physical, observable object serve as the source of metaphysical and moral authority, makes religion far more accessible and powerful to a lay community. Similarly, as lay communities in past eras have not had the time, resources, or the power to develop complex methods of theological interpretation, it makes economic sense to delegate authority to experts whose job it is to connect the text of holy books and prophetic utterances to the conditions of contemporary life. And of course, the power of ritual in building collective identity and imparting norms of conduct are well documented. But in the past century or two, we've had some changes. We are, as a society, far better at abstract thinking than ever before. Consider the phenomenon of the Flynn effect, where in the past century IQ test scores are consistently being reweighted as people answer more and more questions correctly. The effect is almost completely confined to those portions of IQ tests which relate to abstraction and logic. In the past century, IQ test scores have become so much higher that were someone from 1912 to take a test under today's scoring rubric, they would likely score as borderline developmentally delayed. Steven Pinker discussed the Flynn effect at length in his recent book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, and has suggested that it is the result of the intellectual impact of the Enlightenment upon our society. The social theorist Jürgen Habermas defined the intellectual character of modernity as one in which validity claims are increasingly separated into independent categories of truth, righteousness, and aesthetics, allowing discourse to separate scientific facts from values and from feelings. It is far more possible for people in our age to hold and apply abstract systems of values than for people in prior ages and social arrangements. And our schooling system offers a far more comprehensive and robust mechanism for idea transmission than has been available to societies in previous eras. At the same time, the features identified in the supernatural beliefs definition and in the opiate of the masses definition, they can be analytically separated from a Durkheimian understanding of religion. They certainly aren't unique to those systems of thought developed in deserts by robe-wearing bearded men with the end for bigamy and genital mutilation. For example, dogmatic Marxist-Leninism might evince a similar unverifiability in basic doctrine, lack any reality check, and similarly specify absolutist visions of right and wrong, of natural law, and epistemology. Belief systems such as Jainism, Taoism, or Confucianism also do not typically involve deities or church-like institutions, and yet they are typically understood to be religions. The last definition that I want to mention for religion is the one that first led me to think of myself as possibly religious, despite my avowed atheism, contempt for sacred cows, and aversion to any sort of collective ritual and worship. It comes from the rather odious Catholic legal philosopher John Finnis, very unfortunately. To paraphrase, religion is the proposed connection between the order of metaphysical categories that comprise the universe and our own personal order of preferences and values. Basically, this is saying that religious beliefs are what connect how we feel about good and bad to the structure of our world. what sort of things carry moral significance, what sort of categories of meaning are possible, and what sort of status within them our desires hold. By this definition, any system of belief which proclaims the fundamental legitimacy of certain norms of behavior and which specifies a definition of good could be called religious. It's therefore also another very broad definition, and one which renders most people religious. But I nevertheless think that using it prompts some good critical thought on just what it is that we're doing when we talk about right and wrong. If there's one conclusion that I hope you take from this long discussion of how to define religion, it is that it is a highly contentious and complex concept. And there are clearly some ways in which a good critical thinker could reach the conclusion that humanism can be productively understood as a religion. So, to review, humanism is a belief system that tells us what it means to be good, how to be good, and how to know how to be good. Goodness is something to do with human well-being, or possibly the well-being of anything sentient. Goodness is achieved through interpersonal conduct and practice, and in practice it means actively seeking a liberal cosmopolitan society with secular institutions. And the pathways to goodness are to be discovered through the use of reason, through discourse, and through scientific inquiry. Humanism thus contains types of beliefs which establish some things as meaningful or sacred. That's the definition slide back. I mean, how can you falsify the hypothesis that human beings should be happy? Or, depending on your methodology, how can you abduce it? How can you dissuade someone for whom human life carries intrinsic worth of this particular sacred value? And how can you possibly convince somebody lacking it? How do we know that morality is about interpersonal conduct and not, say, adherence to natural law? I mean, there are no natural laws. Sorry, I'm taking a different field at this point. There are no natural laws, but I have no reward for thinking that that human well-being is intrinsically good. These things are sacred. We just presume them. And we might consider their effectiveness in helping us to live satisfying lives, but we cannot assess them for validity, nor deduce empirical evidence to support or refute them. One might even say that we take them on faith, though I personally feel that the term faith is semantically unrescuable. Humanist organizations engage in collective activities to propagate and realize humanist values. There's a 3 or 4 page PDF document from the BHA on all the various rituals that you can do, including baby namings. This one surprised me, but yes, all of these things. Humanist organizations hold festivals and celebrations, and humanist officiates perform marriages. Harvard has a humanist chaplain. Humanist groups organize political activism, educational campaigns, charity, and recreational gatherings. The BHA has a humanist choir. They sing every spirit is sacred. Humanist organizations thus certainly oversee collective ritual behaviors and facilitate the formation of communities organized around the principles and values held sacred by humanists. Nevertheless, there are certain things that humanism lacks, despite the existence of humanist organizations which do have some structures of authority and some institutions of practice. There are no humanist prophets and no humanist popes. There are no revelatory texts from which humanist truths can be derived. And there are no standardized, mandatory hermeneutic methods of humanist interpretation by which such derivations must be produced in order to be authentic. I have argued that these things are not essential to a good understanding of religion, but they are nevertheless prevalent in most of the things that we are likely to call religions when we encounter them. This suggests that if we are going to call ourselves religious, we are going to have to be very clear about just what it entails. So, what are the implications if we decide that humanism is a religion? What do we call ourselves? Well, first and foremost, if we do call ourselves religious, we limit ourselves rhetorically and philosophically. We can no longer treat religion as an enemy, strive for its marginalization, and argue that humanism is a non-religious alternative. We can no longer treat theism and the supernatural and religion as inseparable. We have to be more specific in our criticisms and focus on the ills of dogma and superstition rather than on religion in general. We may have to argue that the interference of particular religions and politics is not bad because it's religious, but because it violates liberal democratic principles. We may need to abandon our current understanding of secular government, since it may be logically absurd to suggest that a political sphere could be non-religious. We couldn't go into schools and say, well, we're not preaching, these aren't religious beliefs. And we have to face The smug faces yammering on about how our beliefs are just as faith-based as theirs without an easy response, such as this one, atheism is a religion like not collecting stamps is a hobby. That's the one I like best. But we'll also empower ourselves. Besides all of the broad social legitimacy and the legal benefits accorded to religious groups, we'll enable ourselves to appeal to the yearning for existential meaning that so many people search for and find in temples and in ancient texts. We can say that it is possible to be good without God because the absence of the sacred, the absence of deities does not entail the absence of the sacred. We can find moral and theological allies in the more humanistic and liberal branches of mainstream religions, and we can join them in campaigns for social justice without hypocrisy. And we'll subvert from within the shield that multiculturalism provides for bad behavior when we do criticize other groups. We can better understand what humanism is and what it can offer. Do you like my Photoshop? Alain de Botton, a Swiss-British philosopher, has suggested that a temple to atheism be built. He suggests that atheism can be expanded to provide existential answers and religious goods in a way analogous to other religions. Never mind the terrible mix-up of terms, atheism isn't a belief system at all, but consider what a temple to humanism might be. De Botton has suggested that a huge building with fossils from various geological eras be embedded within its walls, and space for meditation and contemplation. Why not have a museum of humanist philosophy and some botanical gardens of rare and endangered plants and some lecture halls? The point is that we should embrace the human propensity to step inside a vast architectural marvel, look around and feel something profound. Theism and superstition need not have a monopoly on profundity. We can and we do offer it too. Okay, well, I have some discussion questions, and hope that wasn't too long-winded.